Hey, I'm Chris Zepp from Make Everything, and today we're going to be making this really simple steel railing for this basement staircase. Check it out. So to start out this project, I wanted to design some offset brackets that I could use to hold this steel handrail off the wall. I had seen a drawing of a bracket that the client had actually tried to order, but they couldn't get anything in stock in the time that they needed, so I had a little bit of inspiration. I wanted to do sort of a 45-degree bent bracket with a curved interior to add a little bit more rigidity, and I laid it out on a scrap piece of wood. You can see the two 45-degree bends and then the curve. Laying it out like this allows me to get a basis of idea for how long the pieces need to be, and then I take some 1/8 inch by 1 inch flat stock and start cutting up some small pieces of steel and marking them out where I think the bends are going to go. This stuff will be strong enough and nice and light. Now this is my new die for a bender, which is called a Hossfeld bender. This old Tony did a video about universal metal benders, and this is basically one of those. This die acts like a little mini press brake, and it's really versatile and allows you to do a lot of different things. In this case, I'm able to bend the 45s and even able to bend the curves by sort of chomping at it and bending it as we go. This is a new tool for me, and I thought this was a great way for me to kind of try it out and see how it would work in a practical application. The idea of the bent section with the curved section inside would sort of act like a bridge truss, give it a little bit of an aesthetic, and also give it a ton of strength without having to use some heavy, cumbersome material like 3/8 or even thicker than that to make sure that this railing doesn't bend under load. I use the setup blocks that came with my strong hand table to jig this up nice and perfectly square, and this is a really great way to weld up a fixture like this where you're only really going to make it once or twice, and you don't want to have to build an actual jig that you would then have to then take apart. With these blocks, you can use their little ball catches to block them together, and then I'm just using a couple of clamps to hold it in place so it doesn't warp but stays perfectly 90 while I'm welding it. I'm actually using a piece of 1.5" ID black pipe for the railing. It was what I could get fast, and there wasn't really a lot of time to order something from the metal supplier on this. Now this stuff is a pretty heavy wall, but it is very weldable. It does have a coating on the outside. I can't tell if it's paint or something from the shop, so I will have to grind that off. Now I'm over on the Torchmate plasma table where I'm going to make some brackets to mount this to the wall and also some end caps to cap the ends of the pipe. I'm using the Torchmate's shape library to draw these shapes, so I don't actually have to do anything on the computer, which is really nice. This is some 1/8 by 3 flat stock. Now in the shape library, I can draw a round flange with holes. Now by tweaking some of the values directly on the computer that's attached right to the machine, I'm able to make this 3-hole pattern in a 3-inch round circle, which is going to allow me to bolt these to the wall. It's really nice being able to do this type of work right on the Torchmate, because it just means that I don't have to go over onto the computer and do multiple steps. I can just design on the fly like this. It visualizes exactly what I'm going to get, and then I can cut them out. I did a little bit of chamfering on the edge and then used some magnetic holds to keep the caps in place while I weld them. You'll notice I made the caps a little bit smaller than the actual OD of the pipe, which would give me a nice location for me to put in some weld. And once I grind the weld down, I can put a little chamfer on there, which will clean it up and make it look really nice. I want to say that the overall OD of this pipe was 2 inches, so I made these about 1 3/4 inches, and then it gave me that little bit of a gap, about 1/8 inch around the entire circumference. While that was cooling down, I went over to my 2x72 grinder. This is my Broadbeck grinder, and just ground down some of those welds and rounded off the brackets so that they would look a little cleaner. These still obviously have to get welded to the wall bracket and the rail, so there'll be more grinding to do, but for now they look a little bit better. And I decided I was going to use a little bit larger of a screw, so I had to drill out those holes that I cut on the plasma table and then deburr them off the plasma table just a little bit so that they would sit flat on the table. Now I wanted to make sure I didn't weld too close to where those Tapcon screws were going to be, so I dropped them through so that I knew that my weld wouldn't interfere with them, and then I was able to tack them in place and then do the rest of the finish welding. I weld on 2 sides and on the back to make sure that these are very, very strong. It's nice utilizing a fixture table in this way where you can drop hardware through it. It doesn't always work out, but in this case the spacing was perfect so that I could drop my Tapcons through and make sure that I wasn't going to weld in a way that would affect the actual placement of the anchors. While those cooled down, I brought the piece of railing outside and I used the Pferd Victograin discs to grind down all that heavy weld, which gets me from a welded surface to a really smooth surface very quickly. And then I used one of these sort of pipe polishing tools. This one I got on eBay with a 120 grit sandpaper to clean that up and make it nice and smooth. This is a very inexpensive one. It does a pretty good job. And then I can go back with a higher grit flap disc. This is a 120, and just clean up that edge and blend it out. I also measured out where my brackets are going to sit off the end, and I I ground some of the areas that I'm going to be welding to so that I wouldn't have to try to weld through that paint. I want these brackets to bend around the railing, so I hit them over the horn of the anvil cold just to give them a little bit more of a contour so that they'll wrap around and I won't have to fill so much in with weld. I was going to heat these up, but I honestly didn't want them to move that much, and with a couple good hammer strikes I was able to bend these cold, and they wound up sitting a lot better on the railing than they were when they were just flat. Again, I'm using my setup blocks and some clamps to line these things up so that everything is going to sit perfectly against the wall. Using a fixture table like this with setup blocks really just makes life so much easier. This is something that would be so much harder to do just on a flat metal table. Being able to line up these sort of abnormally shaped brackets and be able to keep everything perfectly square and flat so that when you mount this thing, there's nothing that's going to be surprising. Everything's going to just mount straight on the wall with no issues. So I'm able to tack everything, then weld all the different sides, make sure this thing really gets bonded onto there super, super well. Once that's all done, I can go back outside and take the flap disc and grind away some of those welds and really just clean this thing up. There was some little kind of bite marks from when I bent the curve, so I ground those in, which was really quick, and just welding and grinding all that stuff down so that everything's nice and smooth so that when you run your hand over the railing, you don't feel any sharp edges or any burrs or anything like that. I also cleaned up the edge a little bit just to make sure that everything was nice and smooth before I went and primed it with a Rust-Oleum rusty metal primer. I like to use this brown primer versus the white for something that's going to really live outside like this because I just feel like it does a little bit better of a job. Plus, because it's darker, if some of the paint does get scratched, it's a little less noticeable than the white. I put a piece of wire on it and brought it inside to hang up so it could dry. Once that dried, I took it back outside and painted it with a satin black exterior paint, also from Rust-Oleum. Now over on the site, it's going down into this basement stairwell, and there's a railing already on the left side, so it doesn't actually have to encompass the entire staircase. We went with a 5-foot long rail, which is what we were going to originally order and was approved. So we just made sure to check and make sure it was the correct height. I went with about 32 inches off the nose of the step, which is code, and marked it with a Sharpie before I went back in with a little hammer drill and pre-drilled for the Tapcons. Now before I installed these, I had actually painted 8 of the Tapcons black so that they would look nice and clean, just the heads, and I only needed 6, but obviously painting a couple extra is good. These things have a tendency to break if you put them under too much stress. So I like to screw them in, make sure that the holes are deep enough, and really make sure that you drill those holes out really, really well, because any dust can make the Tapcons bind, and once they snap, you'll pretty much never get them out. Once it was mounted, I vacuumed up any of the dust, and then went back in with some cardboard and some spray paint to touch up any of the areas that might need it, and this thing came out great. Gave it a little bit of time to dry, made sure nobody touched it, and it's good to go. All right, that about does it for this one. Like I said, super simple. I did a little bit of kind of creative work with the brackets, which was kind of fun. It's always nice to sort of just design on the fly and make something so functional and really, really quickly. So like I said, this is just going down an exterior basement wall. I use those 2.5 inch long Tapcons to tie it in, and it's super, super sturdy. I had to do a little bit of touch up in the field with some spray paint, but it'll dry outside and this thing will last a really, really long time. So really happy with it, and the client is also super happy. It's going to help them sell this house as this was required for code during the sale process. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please leave them down below. Any suggestions on how you would have done this project differently, let me know. I'll put links down in the description to some of the products and consumables I use, like the Pferd grinding discs and the other things down there. If you want to see what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis, follow me right here on Instagram at MakeEverythingShop. I post all the time. I posted a bunch of videos on how I was using the new bender to build this thing and bend those little brackets, and a couple little process shots along the way. Thanks again for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.